The town of Craven Hollow had always been small, a dot on the map that most travelers missed unless their car broke down on the way to someplace better. Nestled deep in a valley surrounded by thick woods, the place had an eerie charm that residents called quaint. Outsiders, they'd call it unsettling. Everyone in Craven Hollow knew everyone else. It was the kind of place where no secret stayed buried for long, or so people thought. It all began on an ordinary autumn evening. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional rustle of dry leaves sweeping across the pavement. Marcy Dunn, a high school senior, was walking home after tutoring sessions at the library. She took the usual route past the shuttered storefronts, the old diner, and the hardware store with its perpetually flickering neon sign. She never took the woods path, not after dark. Nobody did. As Marcy rounded the corner to her street, she heard it, a faint, wet thwack. She froze, the hair on her arm standing on end. Turning toward the sound, she saw nothing but shadows dancing under the dim glow of the streetlight. Her breath hitched as another thwack echoed, closer this time. Clutching her bag tight, she ran the rest of the way home, the sound chasing her all the way. That night, the town's lone deputy, Grant Miller, received a call about an abandoned car on the edge of the woods. It belonged to a man named Alan Price, a newcomer renting a rundown house just outside town. Nobody really knew him, just another drifter passing through. When Grant arrived, the car was still running, the driver's door wide open. Price was nowhere to be found. What Grant did find was a smear of blood on the steering wheel and a single boot lying in the grass nearby. The townsfolk whispered about it the next morning. Missing persons weren't unheard of in Craven Hollow, but they were rare enough to stir unease. Still, life went on. People had jobs to do, families to feed, but the whispers didn't stop. 3 days later, the first body turned up. It was Karen Little, the school librarian, found dangling from a tree at the edge of the woods. Her hands were tied behind her back with barbed wire, her eyes wide open, lips stretched into a grotesque grin. Carved into her chest was a single word: liar. Craven Hollow descended into chaos. The mayor called in the state police, but they found no evidence, no witnesses, nothing but that single haunting word carved into Karen's flesh. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some blamed Alan Price, claiming he was part of some cult. Others whispered about something older, something tied to the woods. The stories varied, but they all shared one thread. Whatever was happening, it wasn't human. The second victim was found a week later. Tommy Griggs, the town's mailman, was discovered in the basement of the abandoned church at the edge of town. He was nailed to the wall like a crucifix, his mouth sewn shut with fishing line. Above him, painted in his own blood, was another word: thief. By now, the fear in Craven Hollow was palpable. People locked their doors, drew their curtains, and refused to venture out after sundown. But the killings didn't stop. Over the next month, 4 more bodies were found, each marked with a single word: coward, betrayer, cheater, killer. The words seemed random at first, but some of the older residents began murmuring about long-forgotten scandals and grudges, buried deep but not forgotten. It was around this time that Marcy began to notice something strange about her neighbor, old Mrs. Hargrove. She'd always been odd, a recluse who rarely left her house, but now there was something more. At night, Marcy swore she saw lights flickering in Mrs. Hargrove's attic, and she could hear whispers, too faint to make out, coming through the walls. Once, she even thought she saw Mrs. Hargrove standing in her yard, staring at the woods with an expression Marcy couldn't place. Fear? Or something worse? Determined to get answers, Marcy confided in Deputy Grant. Together, they decided to confront Mrs. Hargrove. The plan was simple: ask her what she knew, try to put the pieces together. But when they arrived at her house, they found the front door ajar and the smell of decay wafting out. Inside, the house was a nightmare. The walls were covered in yellowing newspaper clippings, each detailing unsolved crimes and disappearances from decades past. In the center of the living room was a crude altar made of bones, candles burning at its base. And there, slumped in a chair, was Mrs. Hargrove, her throat slit, a bloody knife still clutched in her hand. Scrawled on the wall behind her in jagged, frantic letters were the words, "It won't stop." Grant called for backup, but by the time reinforcements arrived, the altar was gone. The candles were snuffed out, and the house was silent as a tomb. The official report labeled Mrs. Hargrove as the killer, a deranged old woman driven mad by her own guilt. But Marcy didn't believe it. She couldn't. That night, she dreamt of the woods. She saw twisted, gnarled trees and shadows that seemed to move on their own. She heard whispers, faint but insistent, calling her name. When she woke, there was dirt under her fingernails and leaves in her bed. The killings stopped after Mrs. Hargrove's death, but the town was never the same. People moved away, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The woods seemed darker, the shadows deeper. And Marcy? She started walking home through the woods, humming a tune she didn't recognize but couldn't stop singing. Sometimes, late at night, the people of Craven Hollow still hear that wet thwack echoing through the streets, but no one dares to look. Deep in the Appalachian foothills lies Ashfield, a withered little town trapped in the shadow of its former glory. Once a thriving mining community, Ashfield was now a husk of itself, with its rotting buildings leaning precariously over the cracked streets. Everyone who remained in Ashfield whispered about the town's cursed history, but no one spoke too loudly for fear of stirring whatever lingered there. The tragedy of Ashfield began with the collapse of the Barrett mine 30 years ago. 42 miners were entombed in the earth when the tunnels caved in, sealing their fate beneath layers of stone. Rescue teams tried for weeks, but the deeper they dug, the stranger the circumstances became. Tools vanished, lights flickered and died, and some workers claimed to hear faint voices calling from below. Eventually, the mining company declared it too dangerous to continue and abandoned the site. The town would never recover, but the voices never stopped. Late at night, people near the mine would hear them, soft, mournful, and too human to dismiss. At first, they blamed it on the wind or the way sound echoed in the empty buildings, but the voices grew more insistent. They began to sound familiar. "We know who you are," they'd whisper. "Why did you leave us?" As years passed, Ashfield's population dwindled. Most families fled, leaving only the stubborn or the desperate behind. One of the latter was George Redding, a drunk who spent his evenings wandering the streets and mumbling about the mine. "They ain't gone," he'd slur to anyone who'd listen. "They're just waiting." No one paid much attention to George until he disappeared one foggy November night. Search parties combed the woods and abandoned buildings, but all they found was his mangled hat outside the entrance to the old mine. The whispers in town grew louder after that, and folks began to notice strange things. Lights flickered in empty windows. Figures moved in the shadows of condemned homes. At night, the air filled with the stench of damp earth and decay. People would wake up to find their front doors wide open, no matter how many locks they'd secured the night before. Others claimed to hear heavy footsteps crunching over gravel, only for the sound to stop just outside their bedroom windows. Then came the dreams. Everyone in Ashfield began dreaming of the mine, the same dream every night. In it, they stood at the entrance, looking down into an abyss of impossible darkness. A voice, low and guttural, would speak from the depths. "Come back," it would say. "Finish what you started." When people woke, they found their feet covered in dirt, or their hands trembling with bruises, as if they'd been digging. It wasn't long before the first incident occurred. Betty Jean Harrow, a reclusive widow who lived near the outskirts of town, had a particularly vivid nightmare. The next morning, her house was silent. Neighbors went to check on her and found the front door ajar, her small home filled with the overpowering smell of iron. Betty Jean's body was discovered sprawled on the kitchen floor, her fingernails torn off, her hands covered in soil. She had dug at the linoleum as if trying to escape through it. Etched into her dining room wall in shaky letters were the words, "Blood for Earth." Panic consumed Ashfield. Families barricaded themselves indoors. Children weren't allowed out of sight. The remaining townsfolk formed patrols to monitor the mine at night. But none of the volunteers made it past the first evening. The same thing happened to each of them. Around midnight, they'd hear faint scratching sounds coming from deep in the woods. One by one, they would vanish, only for their bodies to turn up days later, broken, bloodied, and always marked by those same three words. The final straw came when the church burned down. No one saw how it started, but the fire tore through the wooden structure in minutes. When the townsfolk gathered at the smoldering ruins, they found the church bell melted into a strange, twisted shape. But that wasn't the worst part. In the center of the ashes, they found the charred bodies of 8 people who had been missing for weeks. Their hands were linked, their heads bowed as if in prayer. That night, the mayor declared the town cursed and urged everyone to leave. Most heeded his warning, abandoning Ashfield with little more than the clothes on their backs. But some stayed behind. Whether out of defiance, fear, or madness, no one knows. Decades have passed since then, and Ashfield remains forgotten, a ghost town shrouded in rumors and unease. Adventurers sometimes venture there, drawn by the legends. They return with wild stories of lights moving through the trees and distant screams that seem to echo endlessly. But some never return at all. Locals in nearby towns still talk about Ashfield in hushed tones. They claim you can still hear the voices if you venture too close. They'll call your name, plead for help, make promises they can't keep. And if you're foolish enough to answer them, they say, the earth will swallow you whole, and the mine will have one more voice to add to its collection. The town of Black Hollow was the kind of place that didn't show up on maps. Nestled deep in the pines, it existed in isolation, untouched by time. People only ever heard of Black Hollow when passing through nearby towns. Don't go looking for it, they'd say. The road there doesn't let you leave. Of course, such warnings were irresistible to thrill seekers, urban explorers, and ghost hunters. They'd pack their gear, hop in their cars, and drive toward the infamous Hollow. Most turned back when their GPS failed or the road seemed to stretch endlessly, but some kept going, and none of them were ever seen again. The story of Black Hollow truly began with an event that locals simply referred to as the Vanishing. Back in 1953, Black Hollow was a thriving logging community. Over 100 people lived there, families, workers, shopkeepers. Then, one cold October morning, the town ceased to exist. Travelers passing by found the place deserted. Every building remained intact. Houses stood as if waiting for their owners to return. Tables were set for meals that never happened, and tools were scattered mid-task. But there were no people, no bodies, not a single trace. The government sent investigators to figure out what had happened. They found no signs of struggle, no mass graves, no evidence of evacuation. The town was just empty. As the weeks passed, strange details emerged. Radios brought into Black Hollow emitted only static. Compasses spun wildly, and there were reports of eerie sounds, whispers, faint and unintelligible, carried on the wind. By December, the case was closed, officially labeled an unexplained disappearance. Black Hollow was left to rot. That should have been the end of it. But people couldn't stay away. The first reported encounter came years later, in 1972. A couple driving through the area claimed to see lights flickering among the trees where the town should have been. Thinking it was a campsite, they pulled over to investigate. Hours later, the man stumbled into a nearby town, disoriented and covered in scratches. He couldn't remember what happened or where his girlfriend was. His only recollection was of her walking toward the lights, drawn by the faint sound of laughter. Her body was never found. In the decades that followed, more stories trickled in. Hikers described hearing children's laughter, only to find footprints in the mud that abruptly stopped. A hunter claimed he stumbled upon Black Hollow itself. The buildings untouched, but draped in vines, the air thick with the smell of rot. He swore he heard someone breathing behind him, but when he turned around there was nothing there, only the sound of footsteps retreating into the woods. Then there were the mirrors. Every account involving Black Hollow mentioned them. Scattered throughout the town were old, tarnished mirrors hanging on walls, leaning against trees, or lying shattered on the ground. They reflected things that shouldn't have been there, figures that didn't belong, shadows that moved independently. One camper described seeing his reflection blink when he hadn't. Another claimed the mirrors whispered when touched, speaking in voices they recognized but couldn't place. The most disturbing encounter came from a man named Jack Elwood, a journalist investigating the disappearances. Jack was skeptical of the rumors and determined to prove Black Hollow was just an abandoned town with an overactive mythos. Armed with a camera, flashlight, and recorder, he set out alone. Jack's final recording was found months later, buried under leaves at the edge of the forest. Recording begins. There's nothing here, Jack mutters, his voice shaky but determined. Just empty buildings. This whole place is... Wait. What the hell? The sound of shuffling footsteps follows, along with the creak of a door opening. I'm in what looks like an old diner, he continues. Everything's covered in dust, but the mirrors. There are mirrors everywhere. Some are cracked, but they're clean. Too clean. A long pause, then a sharp intake of breath. My reflection's moving. No, that's not. What is that? There's something behind me. The recording becomes chaotic. Jack's breathing quickens and objects clatter as he stumbles around. Who's there? He shouts. Show yourself. The whispers begin faintly, barely audible at first, but they grow louder, overlapping into a chorus of voices. Stay! Stay with us! Stay! Jack screams, and the sound abruptly cuts off. No one has dared to return to Black Hollow since Jack's disappearance. Over the years, even the towns nearby have grown eerily quiet about it, as if trying to forget it ever existed. Travelers who ask about the place are met with silence or cold stares. And yet, late at night, some claim to see faint lights flickering among the pines, accompanied by laughter that seems to echo endlessly. They say the road to Black Hollow is still there, hidden among the trees. But if you find it, take heed. Once you enter, the mirrors won't let you leave. In the remote town of Stillwater, nestled in a deep valley surrounded by dense forests, something sinister lurked beneath the surface. To outsiders, Stillwater was idyllic, a picturesque settlement with neat houses, a friendly community, and an air of old-fashioned charm. But those who lived there knew the truth. The town had a secret, one it could never escape. It began with the well. The well stood in the center of town, a crumbling stone structure older than Stillwater itself. No one knew who had built it or how far down it went. It was sealed decades ago after a child vanished near it, but even before then, people had avoided it. They claimed to hear things, whispers echoing from its depths, faint and mocking. Others said the water had a metallic taste, sharp and bitter. The mayor had the well boarded up, but it didn't matter. The whispers never stopped. The townsfolk called it the Hungry Well. They spoke of it only in hushed tones, sharing warnings with new arrivals. Never go near it after dark, never stand too close, and never, ever listen to the whispers. Then came the disappearances. The first was Mary Coulter, the local baker, who vanished one chilly November evening. Her husband found her apron lying near the well, damp and streaked with mud. A search party combed the area, but there was no trace of her. Next was young Danny Parker, a curious boy who didn't heed the warnings. His mother found his bike tipped over by the well, its wheels still spinning. By the time the sheriff arrived, there were no footprints, no sign he'd ever been there. One by one, people began to vanish. Always at night. Always near the well. At first, the town tried to rationalize it. Wild animals. A kidnapper. But the explanations didn't hold. The disappearances were too clean, too strange. And then, people started to hear the voices. Tom Wilson, the town drunk, was the first to confess. He claimed the whispers were louder now, and they knew his name. They keep calling me, he said, his eyes sunken and hollow. They say they can show me what I lost, I just have to look. A week later, Tom disappeared, too. The whispers grew bolder after that. People began hearing them in their homes, soft and insistent, especially on windy nights. Come closer, they'd say, we have what you need. And yet, no one ever dared to open the well. Not until the Whitlock family moved to town. The Whitlocks were outsiders, new blood in a town that rarely saw it. They'd bought the old McCrae house at the edge of the square, a place no one had lived in for years. The family seemed nice enough. A father, a mother, and their teenage daughter, Claire. They didn't know about the well, and no one warned them. Claire was the first to hear the whispers. She told her parents the house made strange noises, like voices murmuring late at night. Her father dismissed it, blaming the wind, but Claire wasn't convinced. One evening, she followed the sound to her bedroom window. From there, she could see the well, faintly illuminated by the streetlights. The whispers grew louder the longer she watched. They're asking for help, Claire told her mother the next morning. I think someone's trapped down there. Her parents dismissed her concerns, but Claire wouldn't let it go. She started spending more time near the well, listening. She began dreaming of it, vivid nightmares where she stood on its edge, peering down into endless darkness. Something in those dreams beckoned her, something familiar. One night, Claire slipped out of the house with a flashlight. She wanted answers. The next morning, her parents found the flashlight lying near the well. The batteries were drained, the bulb flickering weakly. There was no sign of Claire. The town gathered at the square, panic spreading like wildfire. Claire's father, desperate and furious, demanded that they tear the well apart, brick by brick. The mayor resisted, but the man wouldn't back down. Finally, a group of townsfolk pried away the board sealing the well. For the first time in decades, they looked into its depths. At first, They saw nothing but darkness, then a faint movement, a ripple in the shadows. Someone lowered a lantern on a rope. The light revealed something impossible. The walls of the well were lined with faces. Dozens of them, pale and distorted, their mouths open in soundless screams. Their eyes stared blankly, following the lantern's movement. Some faces were familiar: Mary Coulter, Danny Parker, Tom Wilson. And there, near the bottom, was Claire. Her face was fresh, her expression frozen in terror. The lantern's light flickered, and the whispers began again, louder than ever. "More," they chanted. "More. More." The townsfolk fled, sealing the well again with heavy chains and concrete. Claire's parents left town the next day, but the rest of Stillwater stayed, bound by fear and guilt. The well hasn't taken anyone in years, but the townsfolk know it's only a matter of time. The whispers still creep through the streets on quiet nights, calling to anyone foolish enough to listen. And deep below, the faces are waiting. The road to Briarwood is one that many drivers stumble upon by mistake. A narrow, unmarked lane, it winds through dense, fog-laden woods. Locals in the nearby town of Elmstead know better than to travel it, especially after dark. Briarwood isn't on any map, and for good reason. Those who find it rarely come back. It's said that Briarwood was once a thriving settlement established in the mid-1800s. According to legend, the townsfolk were fiercely secretive and unwelcoming to outsiders. No one knows what happened to the people of Briarwood. One day, they simply vanished, leaving the town to crumble into ruin. Over time, the forest reclaimed most of it, leaving only skeletal remains of buildings hidden among the trees. For decades, Briarwood was little more than a cautionary tale, a story told to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. But in recent years, strange occurrences have drawn thrill seekers to the area. Missing persons reports increased. Hikers reported eerie phenomena: laughter that echoed through the trees, the faint chiming of a music box, or figures moving just out of sight. Few dared to enter the heart of Briarwood, and those who did came back different, if they came back at all. One autumn evening, 3 friends, Eli, Sam, and Heather, decided to investigate Briarwood. Eli, an aspiring filmmaker, was determined to document the trip for his YouTube channel. Sam, ever the skeptic, was just along for the ride. Heather, drawn to urban legends, was the one who suggested they go. They piled into Eli's car, armed with flashlights, cameras, and the thrill of adventure. The road to Briarwood seemed endless. The deeper they drove, the thicker the fog became, curling around the car like grasping fingers. Their GPS lost signal, and the radio crackled with static. Still, they pressed on until the trees gave way to a clearing. Before them stood Briarwood. It wasn't much to look at: overgrown ruins and the crumbling shells of buildings. The air was unnaturally still, heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay. A low mist clung to the ground, snaking through the empty streets like a living thing. Eli set up his camera, narrating as they explored. The trio moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the silence. They passed the skeletal remains of a church, its steeple sagging toward the ground. A rusted swing set creaked in a non-existent breeze, but it was the houses that unnerved them the most. Each house was a carbon copy of the next, identical, windowless structures with doors that hung slightly ajar. Inside, the air was colder, the walls lined with strange symbols carved deep into the wood. Sam, ever the skeptic, dismissed it as vandalism. Heather, however, recognized the symbols. "These are wards," she whispered, tracing one with her finger. "Protection spells." But why would they need so many? As they ventured deeper into Briarwood, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Shadows moved in the corners of their vision, but when they turned to look, nothing was there. Heather swore she heard whispering, faint and rhythmic, like a chant carried on the wind. Eli caught something on his camera, a flicker of movement, too fast to make out. He brushed it off as a glitch, but his grip on the camera tightened. At the center of Briarwood, they found the well. Unlike the rest of the town, the well was pristine, its stones untouched by time or decay. Heather knelt beside it, peering into the darkness. A faint sound rose from its depths, soft, melodic, and deeply unsettling. It sounded like singing. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Eli and Sam nodded, their expressions grim. The song grew louder, rising from the well like a siren's call. It was beautiful and horrifying, a sound that filled them with both longing and dread. Heather leaned closer, unable to resist. "Heather, no," Eli grabbed her arm, pulling her back just as the song stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, from the surrounding woods, they heard it. Laughter. High-pitched, childlike, and coming closer. Panic set in as the trio scrambled to leave. But the path back to their car had vanished, replaced by dense forest. The laughter grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. Shapes emerged from the mist, small figures with glowing eyes and impossibly wide grins. Their limbs were too long, their movements jerky and unnatural, like puppets on tangled strings. "They're just kids," Sam muttered, though his voice betrayed his fear. "Right? They're just—" One of the figures lunged, its grin splitting impossibly wide to reveal rows of jagged teeth. Sam screamed as it dragged him into the mist. Eli and Heather ran, the camera still clutched in Eli's hand. The figures followed, their laughter echoing like a taunt. No matter how far they ran, they always ended up back at the well. The song started again, louder this time, pulling at them like a tide. Heather stopped suddenly, her eyes glazed over. "We have to go back," she murmured. "They need us." "Heather?" "No." Eli grabbed her, but she slipped from his grasp, walking toward the well as if in a trance. The figures closed in, their laughter swelling to a deafening roar. Eli turned to run, but the mist thickened, swallowing him whole. Weeks later, hikers found Eli's camera lying in the clearing where Briarwood once stood. The footage was intact, but what it revealed was chilling. The video ended abruptly with Eli's face, pale and streaked with dirt. He stared into the camera, his eyes wide with terror. Behind him, faintly visible in the mist, were the grinning figures, their glowing eyes fixed on him. "They're still here," he whispered. "They're waiting for you." The screen went black. No trace of Eli, Heather, or Sam was ever found. And Briarwood? It's still out there, waiting for the next curious soul to wander too close. In the remote countryside of northern Maine, there is a place known as Hollow Creek. Not because of the babbling brook that once ran through it, but because of the emptiness it left behind. Hollow Creek isn't marked on any official maps anymore. Its name erased as if the world itself was trying to forget it ever existed. But the locals know better. They tell their children not to wander too far into the woods, and they never speak its name after dark. The story begins with the Blair family, who moved to the area in the late 1800s. They were farmers, drawn by the promise of fertile land and isolation. What they didn't know was that Hollow Creek had a history, and it was not one of prosperity. The first sign of trouble came with the animals. The cows refused to graze near the creek. Chickens became agitated, often found dead, with their necks twisted at odd angles. The family dog would stand at the edge of the forest, growling low, its hackles raised, but never daring to cross the invisible boundary. The Blairs chalked it up to the quirks of living in the wilderness. Then the dreams started. Each member of the family began dreaming of the same figure, a woman with hollow eyes and a face half obscured by shadows. In the dreams, she stood at the creek, her feet submerged in the dark, still water. She never spoke, but her presence was suffocating. Over time, her visits grew more frequent. The dreams became nightmares, and the nightmares began seeping into the daylight. One by one, the Blairs began to change. The youngest, Sarah, started talking to someone who wasn't there. She called it the Shadow Lady and claimed the woman told her secrets. Mrs. Blair began waking up in strange places, once in the barn, another time at the edge of the forest, her nightgown soaked with dew. Mr. Rat. Blair took to sitting in the dark, staring at nothing, muttering, "We shouldn't have stayed. She told me we shouldn't stay." The final straw came when the eldest son, Thomas, went missing. The family searched the woods for days, calling his name. They found him at the creek, standing knee-deep in the water, his eyes glazed over. He was whispering something over and over. "She's hungry. She's always hungry." By the time neighbors came to check on the family, the farm was abandoned. The house was left in disarray. Plates still on the table, a chair tipped over, and muddy footprints leading from the front door to the woods. The Blairs were never seen again. For decades, no one dared settle near Hollow Creek. Hunters who ventured too close reported hearing strange sounds. The laughter of a child, the faint hum of a woman singing, or the snapping of branches when no one else was around. Some found crude carvings in the trees, twisting, spindly symbols that no one could decipher. Others claimed to see figures moving just beyond the tree line, vanishing if approached. Then came the hikers. In the 1970s, a group of college students decided to camp near the infamous creek. They were drawn by the legend, eager to disprove it. The first night passed uneventfully, though one of them, Laura, woke up feeling like someone was watching her. She laughed it off, blaming the stories. But by the second night, the mood had shifted. The air around the campsite grew heavy, and the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No insects chirped, no animals stirred. The creek, which had trickled softly the day before, was now eerily still. Around midnight, Laura woke to find her tent empty. She stumbled out into the dark, calling for her friends, only to find them standing in a line at the edge of the water, staring into its depths. "Guys, what are you doing?" she whispered, her voice trembling. They didn't respond. Their faces were blank, their mouths slightly open as if in awe. Then, slowly, one by one, they began walking into the water. Laura screamed, rushing to stop them, but her legs felt heavy, her movements sluggish. As the water reached their chests, their heads tilted back, and she saw it. The Shadow Lady. She rose from the center of the creek, her figure shrouded in darkness, her hollow eyes fixed on Laura. Her voice was like the rustling of leaves in a storm. "You shouldn't have come. She always takes what she's owed." The water swallowed Laura's friends. The last thing she saw before she fled was their faces beneath the surface, staring up at her, pale and lifeless. Laura was found wandering the highway days later, barefoot and incoherent. She spoke of the Shadow Lady, of the water that didn't ripple and the faces beneath it. Her story was dismissed as hysteria, but locals noticed a chilling detail. After her return, Hollow Creek began appearing on maps again, as if beckoning the curious. Since then, strange disappearances have continued. Each time someone ventures near the creek, they leave behind only whispers and footprints. People say if you go there at night, you can hear the water calling your name, soft and insistent. And if you're foolish enough to answer, the Shadow Lady will be waiting. In the quiet town of Ashford, nestled in the Appalachian foothills, there was a peculiar tradition that no one dared question. Every year on October 31st, all the townsfolk would leave their doors unlocked. They'd place a single candle in their windows and hang an empty burlap sack on their doorknobs. Visitors to the town, especially newcomers, often found the ritual bizarre. The explanation, however, was always the same. It's for the taker. No one in Ashford could tell you who or what the taker was. The stories varied. Some said it was a restless spirit, others whispered it was something far older, something ancient and hungry. What they all agreed on was this: the taker came every Halloween, and it always took something. If you followed the rules, it wouldn't take too much. Ignore them and you'd regret it. The rules were simple. 1. Leave your door unlocked. 2. Place the candle in the window to guide the taker's way. 3. Hang the burlap sack so it could make its selection. Failure to follow these rules invited consequences far worse than anyone cared to describe. In 1997, a man named Richard Blythe moved to Ashford. He was a big city transplant, drawn to the town's charm and cheap property prices. When Halloween rolled around, he was confused by the town's strange preparations. His neighbor, Mrs. Ward, came by with a sack and candle, insisting he participate. "It's for your own good, Mr. Blythe," she said, her hands trembling. "The taker doesn't like being denied." Richard, a staunch skeptic, dismissed it as small-town superstition. He humored her by taking the items, but didn't intend to use them. The idea of leaving his door unlocked all night seemed ridiculous. He chuckled as he locked it before heading to bed, blowing out the candle she had given him. The night was uneventful at first. Richard awoke around midnight to an odd sound, a faint rustling, as if someone was dragging something heavy across the floorboards. He sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened. The sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped just outside his bedroom door. "Mrs. Ward?" he called, his voice unsteady. "Is this some kind of prank?" Silence. Then the door creaked open. At first, Richard saw nothing. The darkness seemed to stretch unnaturally, swallowing the faint moonlight spilling in through the windows. But as his eyes adjusted, he noticed a figure. A tall, impossibly thin silhouette that seemed to sway in the shadows. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky, like a marionette with tangled strings. Worst of all were its eyes, hollow, yet somehow full of malice. The taker. Richard froze as it stepped into the room. It moved with deliberate purpose, its head tilting as if examining him. Then it leaned down, its face inches from his, and whispered in a voice that felt like nails scraping across his skull. You denied me. Richard tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. The taker stood, its skeletal hand reaching out toward him. But instead of touching him, it grasped the edge of his nightstand and turned its hollow gaze to the locked door. The lock clicked open. The next morning, the townsfolk found Richard's house in shambles. Furniture was overturned, and deep scratches marred the walls. His burlap sack was gone, as was the candle, but the door was unlocked. In the center of the living room lay Richard, pale and trembling, clutching his chest. He was alive, but barely coherent. His hair had turned stark white, and his voice was little more than a raspy whisper. It took everything, he muttered repeatedly. Over time, Richard regained some semblance of normalcy, but he was never the same. He refused to explain what had happened that night, and he left Ashford before the next Halloween. Those who stayed noticed the taker seemed hungrier that year, the bags left out in its honor returning lighter than usual. The tradition continues in Ashford, but the warnings have grown sterner. The townsfolk whisper that the taker is losing patience, that one day it might not be satisfied with what's in the sack. And if you're in Ashford on Halloween, they'll tell you the same thing they told Richard Blythe. Don't lock your doors. Don't blow out the candle. And for the love of everything, don't ignore the taker. The town of Black Hollow was the kind of place you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. Nestled deep in a forest, it was a quiet, isolated community with one chilling claim to fame. No one stayed out past 9 p.m. It wasn't a law, but it might as well have been. Every shop closed, every house locked up tight, and not a soul roamed the streets after dark. They called it the witching hour. Visitors found the custom odd, but locals avoided the topic altogether. They'd say things like, "It's just our way," or "The nights are darker here." But behind closed doors, they knew the truth. The stories had been passed down for generations. Something came to Black Hollow at night, and it wasn't human. In the fall of 1963, the Myers family moved to Black Hollow. James Myers was a skeptic by nature, a scientist who prided himself on debunking superstitions. When he heard about the town's curfew, he laughed. "Ghost stories to scare children," he scoffed. His wife, Margaret, was uneasy, but James dismissed her fears. Their son, Billy, was more curious than afraid. "What happens if someone stays out?" he asked a neighbor. The old woman's face paled. "You don't want to find out, child," she whispered. On their first night in town, the Myers family followed the rules, bolting the doors and windows by 8:30 p.m. But James couldn't shake the nagging sense of absurdity. And he decided to test the town's superstition the next evening. At 9:05 p.m., he stepped outside. The air was unnaturally still. Even the crickets had gone silent. James walked down the empty street, his breath fogging in the chill. He felt a growing unease, though he couldn't explain why. Then he noticed it. A sound, faint at first, like distant humming. It grew louder, shifting into a melody that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The tune was haunting, beautiful, and wrong. It crawled under his skin, filling him with dread. He turned to go back inside, but froze. Something was standing at the end of the street. It was tall and thin, its limbs impossibly long, its face obscured by shadow. As James stared, it tilted its head as though studying him. The humming stopped. "Hello?" James called, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move toward him. Its gait was slow, deliberate, each step echoing unnaturally in the silence. James backed away, his heart hammering, but the figure kept coming. Its shape became clearer. Its skin was pale and stretched too tightly over its frame, its mouth a jagged slit that didn't quite fit its face. When it was only a few feet away, it stopped. Its head jerked unnaturally, and it whispered in a voice that didn't belong in this world. "Why did you break the rules?" James didn't answer. He couldn't. The figure's hollow eyes bore into him, and he felt an unbearable weight pressing down on his chest. He stumbled backward, the door of his house just feet away, but before he could reach it, the figure lunged. Margaret found James the next morning, lying on the porch. He was alive, but catatonic, his eyes wide and unseeing. His hands were clutching at his throat, as though trying to ward something off. The doctor was called, but nothing could be done. James never spoke again. He died a year later, his expression still frozen in that same look of terror. The Myers family didn't stay in Black Hollow long after that. Margaret took Billy and left, though she never explained why. She only offered one piece of advice to anyone who asked about her husband's death. Stay inside. No matter what you hear, no matter what he No matter what you see, don't go out after dark. Over the years, the witching hour has claimed others, a curious teenager, a drunk stumbling home from the bar, a delivery driver who took a wrong turn. Their bodies are sometimes found, but not always. Those who are found are forever changed, paralyzed by fear, their minds shattered. The town still follows the curfew, the candles in their windows flickering as silent prayers. Outsiders scoff at the superstition, but the townsfolk don't care. They know what waits in the darkness, and they know it's always watching, always waiting for someone to break the rules. In the heart of rural Idaho, there's a stretch of road known only as Deadman's Trail. It's an unassuming gravel path winding through dense, towering pines. By day, it's peaceful, with sunlight filtering through the branches and deer often crossing the road. But by night, the air turns cold, the forest grows darker than it should, and even the bravest locals avoid it. The legend goes that a family wagon broke down on that road in the late 1800s, stranding the passengers, 2 parents and their 3 children, overnight. When townsfolk found the wagon the next morning, the family was gone. The horses were still hitched and the wagon was intact, but deep claw marks scarred the sides and pools of blood stained the ground. No bodies were ever recovered. Some say it was wolves, others whisper of something far worse. Whatever happened that night left a curse on Deadman's Trail, and the disappearances never stopped. A group of teenagers from the nearby town of Pine Haven decided to test the legend one October night. Sam, Lily, Marcus, and Jess were typical thrill seekers, armed with flashlights, snacks, and a Ouija board for good measure. They parked their truck at the trailhead and started walking, laughing nervously at their own bravado. "Nothing's going to happen," Marcus said, kicking a rock down the path. "It's just a stupid ghost story." "Tell that to the missing people," Jess muttered, her flashlight flickering. She hit it against her palm, the light stabilizing. The first hour was uneventful, though the deeper they went, the quieter the forest became. By the time they reached the halfway point, there were no sounds at all, not a bird, not an insect, not even the rustling of leaves. Lily stopped suddenly. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. "Hear what?" Sam asked, his voice low. A faint sound drifted through the trees, a high-pitched giggle like that of a child. The group froze, exchanging uneasy glances. "Maybe it's just the wind," Marcus suggested, though his voice wavered. "It's not the wind," Jess snapped. "Let's go back." Before anyone could agree, the giggle turned into a low, guttural growl. The sound wasn't human. It wasn't animal either. It was something in between. And it was getting closer. "Run!" Sam shouted. The group took off, their flashlights bouncing wildly in the darkness. The growl followed, growing louder, the crunch of heavy footsteps echoing behind them. Lily screamed as she tripped, and Sam skidded to a stop to help her. Jess and Marcus didn't wait, disappearing down the path. As Sam pulled Lily to her feet, his flashlight beam caught a glimpse of something moving in the trees. It was humanoid, but impossibly large, its limbs distorted and too long. Its eyes glowed yellow, fixed on them with a predatory hunger. "Move!" Sam yelled, dragging Lily down the trail. They reached the truck, finding Jess and Marcus already inside, frantically locking the doors. Sam and Lily barely climbed in before Marcus floored the gas, the truck skidding onto the main road. No one spoke, their breath ragged and panicked. But as they reached the edge of town, Jess gasped, pointing at the rearview mirror. "It's following us." In the mirror, the glowing eyes were visible, keeping pace with the truck despite their speed. It ran on all fours, its body twisting unnaturally, its growls echoing in their ears. The truck's engine sputtered, the headlights flickering as if the thing was draining the very life from the vehicle. "Faster!" Lily screamed. Marcus didn't reply, slamming the accelerator to the floor. Just as the truck reached the town limits, the creature stopped abruptly, its yellow eyes disappearing into the darkness. The truck's engine roared back to life, and the headlights stabilized. The group drove in silence, too terrified to speak. When they finally stopped in front of Marcus's house, no one moved for a long time. In the weeks that followed, things got worse. Lily started waking up with scratches on her arms and legs, though her bedroom door was always locked. Sam's dog refused to go near him, growling and cowering whenever he came close. Jess claimed she saw yellow eyes outside her window every night, no matter where she stayed. And Marcus? Marcus stopped coming to school altogether. When the others went to check on him, they found his house empty. His parents hadn't seen him in days. The police found his truck abandoned at the edge of Deadman's Trail, the keys still in the ignition. Inside was a single message, scratched into the dashboard. It wants us back. The legend of Deadman's Trail remains, and locals say that if you drive near it at night, you might see glowing yellow eyes watching from the trees. And if you're foolish enough to venture down the path, you may hear laughter or growling, or worse, find claw marks on your car. Because once you've been marked by whatever haunts Deadman's Trail, it doesn't let you go. It always comes back. In the remote town of Ravenwood, hidden deep in the Midwest, there was an abandoned school that everyone knew to avoid. The building was a crumbling, ivy-covered relic from the 1920s, with shattered windows that seemed to watch you as you passed by. The locals called it Willow Creek Elementary, but everyone simply referred to it as the Whispering School. The story went that in 1947, a teacher named Miss Grayson locked her entire class inside during a fierce snowstorm, claiming that something was waiting for them outside. She told the children that they were safer in the school and refused to let anyone leave, even as the storm grew worse and food supplies ran out. The townsfolk didn't know what was happening until spring, when the snow finally melted, revealing the truth. The school was silent. No one had left, but no one was alive. The children and Miss Grayson were found huddled together in the gymnasium, their faces frozen in terror. The strangest part? Their bodies bore no signs of starvation or hypothermia. It was as though their very souls had been ripped away. From that day on, people claimed to hear whispers coming from the school, even when no one was inside. Lights would flicker in the empty windows, and shadows moved where no person could be. The townsfolk avoided the place, and over time, it was forgotten, except for the occasional daredevil teenager. In the fall of 1986, 4 high school seniors, Maggie, Paul, Jason, and Liz, decided to spend Halloween night exploring Willow Creek Elementary. It was Jason's idea, of course. He was always the ringleader in their misadventures. Armed with flashlights and a cheap Polaroid camera, they climbed through a broken window, laughing nervously as they entered the decaying building. The air inside was cold, far colder than the crisp October night outside. Their footsteps echoed eerily as they made their way down the main hallway. Faded children's drawings hung on the walls, their crayon colors long dulled by time. Desks sat in rows covered in dust as though the students had only just left. "This is lame," Paul said, shining his flashlight around. "Nothing's happening." "Let's go to the gym," Jason suggested with a grin. "That's where it happened." Maggie hesitated. "Maybe we shouldn't." "Don't tell me you're scared," Jason teased, already heading toward the double doors at the end of the hall. The others reluctantly followed. The gymnasium was cavernous and dark, its ceiling dotted with gaping holes where daylight must have once streamed through. Now, only the moonlight illuminated the space, casting long, shifting shadows. At the center of the floor was a strange pattern scratched into the wood, lines and symbols that seemed too deliberate to be random. "What the hell is that?" Liz whispered. "Probably just graffiti," Jason said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. He stepped into the center of the symbols and struck a mocking pose. "Behold, the ghost of Miss Grayson." As he spoke, the temperature plummeted. Their breaths became visible, and a faint, unmistakable sound filled the air. Whispers. "What was that?" Maggie asked, her voice shaking. "Stop messing around," Paul snapped at Jason. "It's not me," Jason insisted, his bravado gone. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a dissonant chorus. Words were impossible to make out, but the voices were high-pitched, childlike, and filled with anguish. Maggie's flashlight began to flicker, then went out. The others followed, plunging them into near-total darkness. "Let's get out of here!" Liz screamed, but as they turned to leave, the gym doors slammed shut with a deafening bang. Panic set in. The group pounded on the doors, but they wouldn't budge. The whispers became screams. Agonized, pleading cries that seemed to come from all around them. Shadows moved in the corners of the room, growing larger, taking shape. Faces emerged from the darkness, children's faces, their eyes wide and mouths stretched open in silent screams. "They're coming!" Maggie cried, backing toward the center of the room. The others followed, their backs pressed together, shaking as the shadows closed in. Jason fumbled with the Polaroid camera, snapping pictures wildly as if that would help. With each flash, they saw more of the figures. gaunt children with hollow eyes and clawed hands reaching out toward them. Behind them stood a woman, tall, skeletal, and expressionless, her shadowy form towering over the others. "Miss Grayson," Paul whispered in horror. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The gym was silent once more, the air heavy and suffocating. The doors creaked open slowly, revealing the hallway beyond. Without hesitation, the group ran, leaving their flashlights and camera behind. They scrambled out of the building and didn't stop running until they reached the safety of the town. The next morning, Maggie returned to the school, determined to retrieve the camera. She found it lying just inside the gym doors, but the film inside had already developed. There were 3 photos, each more terrifying than the last. The first showed Jason standing in the gym, but he wasn't alone. Faint shadows surrounded him, their faces just visible in the grainy light. The second showed the 4 of them huddled together with dozens of shadowy children closing in. The third photo was a close-up of Miss Grayson's face, her hollow eyes staring directly into the lens. Maggie didn't speak of that night again. Jason moved away shortly after, while Paul and Liz avoided her entirely, as though the memory was too much to bear. The school still stands, its windows dark and lifeless. But on certain nights, if you listen closely, you can hear faint whispers drifting through the trees. And if you're foolish enough to enter, Miss Grayson might still be waiting for her next class. The fog rolled in thick and heavy, as if a warning to the few who remained in Hollow Point after sundown. Nestled deep in a forgotten pocket of woods, the town had always felt like a relic of another era. With its cracked pavement, rusted street signs, and houses that leaned like tired old men, Hollow Point's true horror wasn't in its appearance, but in the dark legacy it carried. Legends whispered of the harvest night when townsfolk would suddenly vanish, only to be discovered weeks later, twisted and unrecognizable. It always began with a low hum that resonated through the air, vibrating window panes and making teeth ache. Locals claimed it was the land itself groaning. For those who knew better, it was a calling. Sam Peters had heard the stories all his life. His mother spoke of it with hushed breath, the same way one might speak of a curse they were sure would someday come for them. He'd always dismissed it as folklore until the night he returned to the town for his father's funeral. It started with a flickering streetlight outside the old Peters house. Sam stared at it, his gut churning with unease. His father's last words haunted him. "It's watching. Don't turn your back on Hollow Point." Sam assumed it was the rambling of an old man. But as the light blinked out, a chill ran down his spine. He felt eyes on him, deep, penetrating, unblinking. Inside the house, Sam found pages of his father's journals spread across the dining room table. Each entry chronicled disappearances, patterns that aligned with astronomical events and cycles he didn't fully understand. Scribbled warnings covered the margins. "It's beneath the ground. The hum awakens it. Protect the children." Then came the knock at the door. Soft, tentative. Sam peered through the peephole and saw nothing but darkness. The silence was deafening. He stepped back slowly, his breath caught in his throat, when suddenly a blood-curdling scream tore through the air outside. It belonged to his childhood friend, Angela, who had gone missing a decade ago. Sam staggered back, his heart hammering. It wasn't possible. Angela had been found dead. Desperation clawed at him as the hum began. A deep vibration shook the floorboards, and the house groaned. The walls seemed to breathe in rhythm with the noise. Sam fled outside into the icy night air, where shadows danced along the fog. What he saw rooted him to the ground, twisted figures, grotesque parodies of human form, crawling and writhing, their empty eyes fixed on him. One figure, skeletal and hollow-eyed, lurched forward. It wore Angela's face. "It won't let go," she rasped, her voice layered with static and pain. "It calls us back." Clawed hands reached for him, and Sam bolted toward the church at the town's edge, the only place he remembered being sacred. Inside, a circle of candles burned. He was not alone. Elderly townsfolk knelt, their faces lined with resignation. "You came back," one of them whispered. "You never should have come back." Sam realized with dawning horror that this was not just his father's fight. It was a ritual, a penance Hollow Point paid for sins long buried. The hum swelled, a deafening roar. Shadows oozed through the cracks, consuming everything they touched. The old priest screamed an incantation, but it faltered. Darkness lashed out. Sam grabbed the priest's hand, but it was too late. The shadows wrapped around him, dragging him to the cold earth beneath, where countless others awaited. As he was pulled under, Sam's last thought was not of fear, but understanding. He had become part of the town's legacy, another lost soul in Hollow Point's endless cycle. When the fog cleared the next morning, the town looked the same, quiet and ordinary. The streetlight flickered back on, and Hollow Point waited patiently for its next harvest. The story of Hollow Point lingered like the hum itself, relentless, chilling, and unstoppable. And for those who dared cross its borders, it was a reminder that some towns are best left forgotten